What a nice turnout tonight. It speaks well for our local historical society to have so many folks here to be a part of our presentation tonight. I ask that you take a look at the photo, which you probably already have, but take a look at this photo again to my left, your right. Monday, October 15, 1973, the East Room of the White House. President Richard Nixon leads a ceremony wherein 9 American servicemen receive the highest honor their nation can bestow. All for deeds of bravery and valor that few in this room can appreciate. One of these soldiers is not in uniform. He is from Fairfield, Illinois, and his name is Kenneth Kays, Private First Class. It is one of those rare occurrences where local history intersects with American history. President Nixon spoke often of the generation gap that was so much a part of American life back in 1973. Now, take a look at that photo again and try to imagine a photo which better symbolizes the gap, that generation gap, than the picture that is before you. The original of this photo was donated to the Wayne County Historical Society by a member of the Kays family. Another soldier who is in that room is present with us tonight. His name is Thomas Groppel, then a captain in the United States Army. His job then in October 1973 to escort Kenny Kays to the White House and do everything he can to make Kenny Kays look presentable to his commander-in-chief. That is part of the story you will hear tonight from Colonel Groppel. Thomas Groppel is a native of Wood River, Illinois, and that part of the world is his home. But Colonel Groppel is more than a soldier who was involved in ceremonies. He served with distinction for 2+ tours in Vietnam with the 5th Special Forces Group. He holds a master's degree in international relations from American University, and for years he had one of the most interesting jobs in the world. He was the director and overseer of military ceremonies for the Armed Forces in the District of Columbia. That involved Arlington National Cemetery, that involved the White House. And if you want to learn more about Thomas Groppel, all you have to do is Google his name. I'm going to spell it. If you have a pen handy, you may want to write it down. Groppel. 2 P's, 1 L. Groppel. You Google his name, and one of the first hits you're going to get from Google is an article from 2009 from the New York Times that gives you an idea of what Colonel Groppel did for years and years in the District of Columbia. And it is absolutely fascinating reading. I invite everyone to do that later this evening. Thomas Groppel retired from the Army as a lieutenant colonel in 1986. And in recent years, following the tradition and the example of other great American heroes, folks named, a couple names at random, Washington, Eisenhower. In that tradition, he retired to his farm in Jersey County, Illinois. It is my honor to welcome to the Wayne County Historical Society, Colonel Thomas Groppel.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Am I loud enough? First off, how many read this book? Few? Good. I'd recommend it. There were a number of passages in here I wasn't wild about, but the author had his own opinions. I'd like to do 3 things tonight. I'd like to talk about Kenny Kays. I got a few questions for Wayne County of a historical nature. And I was told that it was recommended that this talk take place in May because of Memorial Day. Who was the member who made that recommendation?
Doug A-Man, stand up.
To talk about Kenny Kays, and sort of, I was exposed to Kenny for 3.5 days. That was my sum total of time spent with Kenny. When he was notified, or he and his family were notified about the medal presentation, an officer out of St. Louis, out of the records division, came over to talk to the family about what was going to take place. At government expense, they were going to be taken from here to St. Louis, flown to D.C., put up in one of the 3 best hotels in town, and we'd go to the White House for the award ceremony, and I'd send them home a day and a half later. So I was on the other end of that. I had just been assigned to Fort Myer about 5 months, so I was a new guy. And so when you had a job that you didn't particularly want, you gave it to the new guy. And so I inherited the job of being Kenny Kays' escort. It's mentioned in the book that the Army wanted Kenny to take his award in uniform. That's true. We very much wanted him to take it in uniform. The other gentlemen that are in that picture, going off to the picture's left, were all in uniform. Kenny was the only one without uniform. But we didn't want the picture of the beard and the long hair. So once I got the assignment to be the escort, I called Kenny's mother and got all of Kenny's sizes, so shirt, blouse, trousers, everything. I went down to the uniforms military sales, and on Uncle Sam's tab put together Kenny's uniform, just like for everything he'd earned and every place he'd been. And so I was told more than once, Groppel, your job is to get him in uniform. So, and back in those days, we didn't have PSA for those who travel nowadays, and have all that security between the time you arrive at the airport and the gate. So you could walk right down to the gate and meet him. I quickly learned when I met him in uniform, Kenny would clam up. Kenny would hardly acknowledge my presence. I got more conversation out of his mom and dad than I did out of Kenny. So when we got back to the hotel, that first thing, I took my uniform off, went to civilian clothes, and Kenny and I started to have a little dialogue. And so that first day I broached the topic that about the Army really wanted him to take the award in uniform. I said to Kenny, no long hair, no beard. I said, we don't have to get high and tight, but we're going to cut some of that hair off. And he didn't oppose it. Matter of fact, he didn't reply at all. So we had about a day before the award ceremony, and just to warm him up, and he said, well, I didn't bring my uniform. So I had his uniform in my room. So I brought the uniform in his room and hung it on the door. He said, it's all made up, Kenny. It's all ready to go. And he said, well, just leave it there. I said, no, it doesn't stay in your room, it stays in my room. My big fear was if I left it in his room, he'd put it on, and he wasn't going to get a haircut, then I'd have to wrestle it off of him. And I didn't want him beat up going to the White House. But, so I kept in my uniform, or in my room, and every time I go talk to him in civilian clothes, I take his uniform with me. I'd hang it on the wall, and I would broach the topic every time we talked. And So on the morning of the ceremony, I was telling him, he was giving a lot of thought. Kenny was in a quandary. And I had gone downstairs, the hotel had a barber shop downstairs. I told the head barber, I says, that chair is mine. I says, nobody sits in that chair. And he says, well, who's paying for it? I says, well, we'll settle up the payment later. I said, but leave one chair empty. I said, I got a candidate upstairs. And so I went up and took the uniform in. I said, okay, Kenny, show and tell time. And he said, well, it's too late to get a haircut. I said, no, got the barber waiting, stand by downstairs. So got it all taken care of. And he was really in a quandary. I really feel that he wanted to put it on. That it was just too much of a sacrifice for him to get that haircut. I said, okay, put your coat and tie on. I took it back in my room, and so I failed on my mission to get Kenny in uniform. But when we got to the White House, and I'll sort of get out of sequence here and make a comment about Kenny. Kenny was a very intelligent young man. I'd say smarter than the average person. Deep thinker. Couldn't always give you his opinion well, but no dummy by any means. And so when we got to the White House, it was always, they had this all lined up. There were, what did you say, 7?
9.
9 recipients. The senior guy was an Air Force Lieutenant Colonel that had been a POW, and I don't know exactly how his citation read. Being a POW didn't qualify to be a Medal of Honor recipient. But he was the #1 guy. And you think this guy was the head cheerleader. I mean, and Mr. Nixon, he gave Mr. Nixon credit for getting him out of North Vietnam. So he was a big Nixon fan. But Kenny was a junior guy there. At the time, he was a PFC. And he'd gotten promoted to PFC after he had his incident where he was awarded the medal. But Kenny was a reluctant player. He was backing up a lot, and I think the fact that his mother was next to him in the wheelchair kept him forward. But until I read the book, I didn't realize the relationship to Kenny that he and I had. I'm 5 years older almost to the month than Kenny was. I'd already been to Vietnam and had my time in and was back. And I'd been back a month before Kenny went in. So it was an interesting event. I think in a lot of ways it was good that Kenny went. I lost track of him after he got back here. I mean, I went on with what I was doing in D.C. And this book was very informative as to, and Kenny struggled, obviously, struggled mightily. And I think the medal probably put a little pressure on him, that people had expectations out of a Medal of Honor recipient that Kenny wasn't prepared to step up to. But and the fact that he died in November of '91 at the age of 43. But to Kenny's credit, Kenny did exactly what he was trained to do as a medic. And I was sharing with Matt I didn't have any contacts with field medics in my time in Vietnam. But our medics were, the special forces were a little bit farther down the road than the line units. But I asked the Vietnam nurse, I said, what did we send the medics to the field with? The line units. And it boiled down to 4 things: bandages, splints, tourniquets, and morphine. So stop the bleeding, set it if you can, and see what you can do about the pain. And that's about all we sent those kids to the field with. If you read Kenny's citation, Kenny did exactly what he was trained to do. Saved a lot of people's lives, and did exactly what the Army wanted him to do. To the point that I think Kenny was probably about played out by daylight when they took him out. So it's not often that you put a tourniquet on yourself, stop the bleeding, and continue to work for 5 or 6 hours till it's over. But I think the book, if you have a chance to read the book doesn't necessarily give Kenny as much credit as he did. As I said this in my opening remarks, the author didn't like the Vietnam conflict, and it shows in the way he presents things. But I would recommend highly looking into it. Any questions for me about Kenny?
I've got one.
Sure.
I've asked you this before, and I think I know what your response is going to be, but I'm going to ask you anyway. When President Nixon walked in the East Room and he lays eyes on this guy with the beard and the long hair, were you in a position where you could gauge and take a look at what President Nixon's reaction was?
Book answer is no. But in later years, I had, as Matt talked about, after I had my 20 years in, the guy I later replaced as civilian asked, well, about 3 years before I was retired, he said, he called me out at an event one time and he said, well, would you consider coming to work for me? I said, why? You know, he's a nice guy, but I didn't understand why I should consider that. And he was the director of ceremony and special events for the military district of Washington, which, as Matt talked in my introduction, all ceremonies in the National Capital Region come through that office. 95% of them go to the executive branch, specifically to the President, Secretary of Defense, and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. They'll probably get 90% of that 95. We send a little bit to the court a couple times a year, and very little to the legislative branch at all. The only relationship I had day to day with the legislative branch was DOD has an agreement with the sitting members of Congress that if a member dies in office, the Department of Defense will provide a casket team and a firing party at the catering of their funeral. So jokingly, I would say on any given day, I had 535 chances to go to work for the Congress. Unfortunately, that didn't happen very often. And I'll share a couple with you. But after I got down to uniform and became, going back to the question about President Nixon, he was, of the 10 presidents I've had occasion to associate with, or be in the presence of, politics aside, personality aside, that gentleman in the corner of that picture there was the most intelligent I was ever exposed to from his time forward. Now, Richard Nixon have a dark side? He did. He had a dark side. But he had recall that was just scary good. And he could sit down, and I can't tell you how many times had occasion to go into a room with him, and he's doing 90% of the talking, and I'm just asking for clarity, and so forth. He had nothing on his desk. Didn't have a notepad, didn't have a pencil, he had nothing on his desk. And it all made perfect sense. It was sequential, it was logical, and you're just steady writing. Just trying to keep up with what he was saying, telling you. And part of that job that I evolved into was we had responsibility for all state funerals. And my predecessor, the guy who hired me into that job, had done Mr. Kennedy's funeral. His name was Paul Miller. Paul told me once, he told me 100 times. He says, now you can do this in the middle of the night if you need to. He said, but trust me, it's not fun to do it in the middle of the night. And when Mr. Kennedy was assassinated, there was not one sentence or one paragraph that had Kennedy and funeral in it. They made that up from the get-go. It was all Paul Miller designing it and asking a couple of key questions about where we're going to end up. Are we going to go to Arlington Cemetery? Are we going to Massachusetts? Where are we going? And once you know where you're going to start, the president lives in the house. He lives in the White House. That's where you're going to start. Tell me where we're going to end up, and we'll go from there. But we're going back to Mr. Nixon. When he left office in August after this event was in October of the next year of '74. That was my first exposure in this arena. And I had just started working with Paul Miller. And the White House military office called the day before he resigned. It was not public knowledge to anybody. And I haven't answered the phone, and I got a little smart on the phone. The guy on the White House end, he and I didn't have much chemistry. And he said, the president's going to resign at 1 o'clock tomorrow. We want a ceremony on the South Lawn. What's it going to look like? Me being a little smart at the time, or ignorant would be a better word. I said, damn if I know. I've never done it before. And he said, well, I don't need any smart answers. He says, I want something over in 2 hours. Okay? Play it. He hung up on me. So I walked across the hall to my boss, the guy who hired me, and he's just a fountain of knowledge. He's always, but he was a great teacher, a wonderful teacher. So I went across and told him about the phone call. He said, well, what do you think that's going to look like? I said, well, I started looking for a little guidance. He said, well, take a shot at it. And he looked at his watch and says, we got 2 hours. So I made 5 trips across that hall. He would never take that piece of paper out of my hand. He'd lean forward in his chair and shoulders down. And he'd ask a couple, he said, what are you thinking here? Why do you want? He said, no, I'm going to tell you. He said, they're not going to question what you give them. They're going to execute exactly what you give them. But after it's all done, you got to explain why the hell you did it. So no one has any more experience than we do. So just be able to defend what you're going to do. So after 5 trips, and he made no attempt to take that paper out of my hand. It was mine. And he said, look at his watch. He said, well, you're running a little short on time. You better clean it up and get it over there. And that was my first exposure to Mr. Nixon. We had no plans on Mr. Nixon. Any funeral plans. So he's off to California. So he resigned in 74 and died in 94. For 20 years, we didn't have any plans. Twice a year, I would call his office, once in the spring and once in the fall. His secretary and I, after 20 years, we became good friends. And we discussed, how our lives were going and so forth. And so, in 93, 1 year before he died, I called that spring, and Kathy says, Tom, I'm putting you on hold. And that first time in 20 years they're putting me on hold. Now, it's not often that you think getting put on hold is good news. News for me. And so she came back and said, how soon can you come up? I said, tomorrow at noon. She said, okay, President, will see you tomorrow at noon. I went in, and so I've been grooming my questions for 20 years as to how to get guidance and where you want to go and how we're going to do this funeral and the whole 9 yards. Well, Richard Nixon didn't want to talk about his funeral. And he knew the topic because I made sure that Kathy warmed him up. He wanted to talk about his wife. And unbeknownst to anybody in the public side of his life, she was ill. Very ill. And she died less than 6 months later. And so I went in with all my questions. Kathy didn't tell me what the topic was. I thought I knew what the topic was. And he started to unload on it. And so I came out with 10 pages of notes. And Mr. Nixon had this unique capability. When he was done talking to you, you heard the click. You heard that this conversation was over. And you just pick up your stuff and leave the room. And so he gave me 10 pages of notes off a clean desk. He wasn't reading off anything. It was all coming out of his head. It made perfect sense. But it was all about her. And so I walked out, and Kathy said, well, how'd it go? I said, I don't know. I said, it'll take me 3 days to get my notes squared away. I said, I'll be back. And I made a number of trips back up to see him for clarity and so forth. But Mr. Nixon had a unique thing. When he got a question he didn't like, he wouldn't try to mislead you. He just wouldn't answer you. And he wouldn't make excuses about not talking to you. He just, you're just talking to yourself. And so I went up and I said, sir, I said, and he wanted, they were living in New Jersey at the time, and he wanted me to take her to Yorba Linda, California, for burial at the library, for those that have been there. And he said, all right, he gave me his guidance and so forth. Billy Graham was going to be involved, and that's another side story. But I said, sir, have you made any arrangements for an airplane? And he still had lots of connections in the corporate world. Silence. I said, sir, I need a big airplane. I'm not going to put Mrs. Nixon in baggage. She's coming up on top. She's coming up in the seating area. And take the big airplane and put a casket up there. And silence. He didn't acknowledge anything. I said, I'm going to the White House and asked for one of the executive airplanes. Silence. No response. I mean, he had to hear it. He may not like what I was telling him, but he had to hear it. And so I was hoping I'd get some response out of him. I got no response. So I went back and said, okay, you played that card, let's see what you're going to do to follow up on it. So I called over the military office and I said, I need to talk to the President's Chief of Staff. President Clinton was in office at the time, His chief of staff was a gentleman out of North Carolina by the name of Erskine Bowles. Young guy, smart as a whip, no nonsense. You don't make small talk with Erskine Bowles. And so they come in on his schedule. I went in. I went to West Wing, and so he's typing on his typewriter computer, and I walk in. He acknowledges I'm in the room. We keep on typing. 3 minutes later, he stops and says, "What can I do for you, Groppel?" I said, "Sir, it's not common knowledge, and I don't want it to become common knowledge. Mrs. Nixon's on her deathbed, and I need an airplane out of executive flight to take her to California." He didn't ask any questions. I mean, that's about the sum total of what I said to him. He said, "No." I sure didn't expect to know. And I just sat there, you know, I was so surprised by the no. And he went back to typing. He stopped typing. He says, "Did I make things clear?" He says, "I take it you don't like my answer." I said, "It might be the dumbest thing I've heard today." And then I finally got myself together and got up and left the room. And I thought, well, by the time I get from the West Wing to the East Wing, I'm going to be fired. And I wasn't. And they said, "Well, how'd that go?" I said, "I'm not sure." And so I went back to my office and started thinking about finding corporate airplanes. A lot of corporate airplanes out there. And next morning, got a call from the military office again in the White House. They said, "Bowles asking for another appointment. What in the hell do you and he have going on?" I said, "I don't know, it's his appointment. It's his meeting." So I went back to see Mr. Bowles. He says, "I take it you didn't like my answer yesterday." I said, "Well, I apologize for what I said, but no, I didn't like your answer." He says, "Why should I give you an airplane?" I said, "Well, sir," I said, "your boss and Mr. Nixon are in a real small fraternity." And I said, don't take what I'm going to say next as a threat. But the word's going to get out that you didn't give Richard Nixon an airplane to bury his wife. And I said, it's a real small fraternity. Someday, your boss is going to be there in the same seat that Richard Nixon did. And he said, "Okay, you made your point. You can have your airplane." So, for that airplane, and of course the Air Force is very upset. In fact, that we're rearranging an airplane and taking seats out and so forth. But she died shortly thereafter. We loaded her in an Air Guard base up in New York. And just to give you an insight as to his intellect, he was the only one going up the front steps. And he walked up the steps, and I was going to be the last one on. And I was standing off to the side. And he got halfway up the steps and he looked to the back of the airplane. He paused, 30 seconds, 45 seconds. Then went back, and then went on up the steps. I went on. We buttoned up, and we're going to California. I'm sitting back in the cheap seats, and when the stewardess came back, said, "Mr. Groppel, the president wants to talk to you." He was up in the president's office. So I went up, he says, first time he used my first name. He said, "Tommy, I want to thank you for this airplane. It's not my airplane. It belongs to Mr. Clinton. Mr. Clinton's airplane." You know, I didn't want to confuse muddy the water with assumptions. He said, "No," he said, "this airplane." I said, "Sir," I said, "I don't understand what you're telling me." He said, "This is 2900. And what he was looking at when he went up that front steps, he was looking at the tail number. That was the airplane he took into China when he opened up China. The man remembered tail numbers. I mean, he just had that that kind of intellect. But I mean, been here, done that 20 years ago, or more. But it shows the interesting side of my job, and I hope that I don't want to put any religious people in the room. Billy Graham was standing on the curb when we pulled up the library, and Billy Graham never traveled with less than 3 ministers with him. And not being ordained, I don't understand all that politics of Billy Graham, an evangelist, and minister. There is a difference, but I don't understand all that politics. And so they were old buddies. So we got the missus in the library and all settled, and people were filing by. We went back out to the car, and President Nixon turned to Reverend Graham and said, "Billy, I want you and Tom to get together about funeral tomorrow." Okay. Well, I had nothing to do with the funeral. I was going to carry the casket in, carry the casket out. It was Billy's funeral. So, to that point, to this point in my life, I have never seen a grown man cry as hard as Richard Nixon did during his wife's funeral. He was sobbing uncontrollably. He wasn't just wiping his eyes. I mean, he was just crying uncontrollably. And I can't imagine how many handkerchiefs he went through. And funeral was over, and I was told I was going to bury her. No cameras, no pictures. It was all encased in enclosure. And I even went around looking in the grass for microphones. I didn't want any microphones, and so forth. So we carried the casket. It was an outdoor ceremony into the enclosure, and everybody turned and went to the reception. President Nixon goes in the reception. Reagans were there, the Clintons were there, the Fords were there, all the formers and the current. And it was going nice crowd. And I was down off to the side with Kathy, and she says, "Well, it's time for him to make his remarks." I said, "He's going to make remarks after what we just saw outside?" I said, "Oh, he'll do okay." I said, "Who wrote these remarks?" "No, he'll just take it off the cuff." So here's a man who just cried his heart out over his wife's funeral, and walked in, he's going to make remarks. And again, made perfect sense, logical, sequential, thanked everybody, called people out by name, and he stopped and pointed to a guy in the audience and said, "You Georgia government, you and I can compete for the highest office in the land, and you're still good enough then to come help me bury my wife." Oh man, what a kick in the butt. I mean, that he has that much composure to hear that all. So, the day before, when we had parted, the president had left Billy Graham and I standing on the curb, he said, "Well, you and Tom get together about the funeral tomorrow." And I had been told Reverend Graham was in charge of the funeral. So as of the day before we buried, I had nothing to do. And so after the president drove off, Reverend Graham and his 3, I'll call them henchmen, ministers, say, "Well, we don't normally do funerals. You know, what's appropriate?" And I've done a lot of funerals in Arlington Cemetery, so I know some of the scripture they use and the ministers use. And well, I didn't want to give a tutorial lesson to Billy Graham on how to bury somebody the night before he's supposed to bury Pat Nixon. I said, "Could we have a meeting tonight at the hotel?" And I didn't want to buy some time so I could go call every chaplain I knew and get scripture and the whole 9 yards. So I went back to my hotel, called every chaplain I knew. I said, "Give me every usable scripture that I can for middle service. So I walked away from that meeting that night with Reverend Graham and his henchmen. What in the hell did I just do? Why am I giving a lesson to Billy Graham and his henchmen about how to bury Christian Nixon? And they're taking notes the whole 9 yards. And I said, it just scared the living hell out of me. So we do the funeral, has a reception, and I put a Marine at each end of the entrance into that burial site. I said, when you see me coming with the president behind me, you guys go the other way, you make sure nobody comes down that walkway. Got it. So I knew exactly who was going to be behind the screen. Reverend Graham, President Nixon, 2 girls, grandkids, son-in-laws, and 1 man. So I had my package. So I sent them behind the curtain. I thought, well, I'm not going to be there. I'm not on that list. So I just backed up against the wall. I said, I ain't going to see it, but I'm going to hear it. Reverend Graham gets in there and says, let us pray. He recites the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer had not been mentioned the night before. He recited the Lord's Prayer. He says, Mr. President, that'll be all. And in fact, we buried Pat Nixon on the Lord's Prayer. I mean, she's a fine lady. I'm sure she didn't need special birds to get where she needed to go. But some people won't need it. But he was an interesting guy. And I don't think Kenny could have frustrated him. He was very sure of who he was. So that concludes the first part of what I was going to say tonight. I have a couple questions for Wayne County. How many of you know Matt Rush? Popular guy. He's the closest thing you have to a celebrity right now. He's president of Illinois Corn Growers. And I understand he's doing a great job. I was a member of that board a number of years back. And it's to his credit that he's shown him enough leadership to become the president. Second question for Wayne County. I cannot tell you the source of what I was reading, but in the early 1800s, probably around 1815, maybe as late 1820, there was a family that left Wayne County and went to Oklahoma. Well, it wasn't Oklahoma then, it was the territories. And there was a white girl stolen from a family by the Indians. She fathered Geronimo. Is that common knowledge in Wayne County?
No. Haven't heard that one.
Okay. Well, might be interesting to see if you can put any credit to that. Geronimo, he was born June 1829, died February of 1909. He buried at Fort Sill. He was a guest of the United States government for a number of years before he died. He was quite a celebrity in his own right. I mean, after he became a prisoner, he was quite a celebrity. But supposedly his mother was a woman out of, or a young girl that was later stolen from, and it was common, like in the John Wayne movie, The Searchers, where they were stealing children, so forth. Okay, that's my second question. Going back to what I shared earlier about congressional funerals, how many people recognize the name Metcalf? Ralph Metcalf. Okay, Joan? Go ahead, sir.
I remember the name.
You Anybody else? No one knows who the other three guys were on the 1936 440 relay team in Berlin. Everybody knows Jesse Owens. Ralph Metcalf was one of the other three. Ralph Metcalf came back and became a congressman out of Chicago. He's one of those 535 chances I had to do a ceremony. I get this call at 5 o'clock at night. Sir, that Lincoln Light is a funeral home in Chicago. We got a dead congressman. Okay? As is the custom in the black community, they tend to go to black funeral homes. The young man on the phone, I later found out, was a junior at Columbia University. And the only reason he was back in Chicago, his dad was having an illness, and he had taken a leave of absence from school. He was in an Ivy League school. He'd come home to help mom run the funeral home. And they had Ralph Metcalf funeral. And very well spoken young man. I mean, no slang, complete sentences. And I was very taken with it. He says, Mr. Groppel, I can't wait for you to see the casket. And that statement didn't fit into any part of the previous conversation. I said, what casket? I mean, what's so unique about a casket? He says, it's marble. I said, really? I said, tell me about your marble casket. He said, well, it's the first one we've ever had. I said, how heavy is it? He said, well, it took 5 of us, and with a lot of straining to get it up on the carrying device. He said, probably in excess of 400 pounds. I said, I've never met Mr. Metcalf. What size individual is he? Well, he'd be 200 pounds plus. So I called my guys back, and they were getting ready to go home. Called them all back in the office. I said, recall that casket team we're taking to Chicago tomorrow. I don't want the best, I want the strongest. I said, this is going to be a big deal. And it was in the south side of Chicago, and I called the Chicago police. I said, am I going to have any problems down there? He said, no, we'll send you some help down. And so the deputy commander said, well, I'll meet you there at 8 o'clock at the church. Service wasn't until 10. And so this guy was a full head taller than I am, and he's there by himself. So he said, well, what do you need? I said, do you expect anybody to get emotional here? He said, well, there'll probably be some pushing and shoving. I said, I'm just worried about from the door to the casket, or to the hearse. He says, okay. He says, I'll be standing right there by the door. He says, just, if you want no more room, just give me the sign. And so they were pushing on the casket team, and I gave them the sign, and you think of the parting of the waters, so Ralph Metcalf is your other Illinois history maker. Probably to wind down here, since we have short on time. Strom Thurmond was Department of Defense South of the World with Strom Thurmond. He was a World War II vet, jumped at Normandy, and DOD did well by Strom Thurmond. We got an Army base there, a Navy base, a Marine base, so DOD put a lot of money into South Carolina. And, well, he retired out of the Senate. Well, I got 535 chances of members, not former members. So, Senator Thurmond had been out about 6 months. I got called this one morning, and I knew the guy from previous dealings. He was in Senator Lott's office, Trent Lott, out of Mississippi, who was now the majority leader at the time. And he said, Groppel, he says, are you aware that Strom Thurmond died? I says, I've heard that. Not on my list of things to do today. And he said, well, Senator Locke wants an exception to policy. And the majority leader can swing a lot of weight. I said, way above my pay grade. I said, you need to talk to the senator, needs to talk to the Secretary of Defense. I said, let me give you a number from Secretary of Office. And I have it by my phone. So I gave him a number and I changed one digit. Just enough that he thinks he must die. No, I didn't give him just a totally phony number. And then I called him ahead of him. I said, you got one incoming on Strom Thurmond. I said, don't flinch. You know, we can't do this. You know, if we flinch on Strom Thurmond, you know, the floodgates are open. So that's all done by 8:30 in the morning. Didn't hear anything all day. I thought, you know, we may have carried the day. About 4:30, phone rang and says, well, we've been thinking about it. I said, oh, come on. Don't flinch now. Well, you know, he's done a lot for the Department of Defense. So I inherited the job of going to South Carolina. And it was my first exposure to our current president. Senator Biden came to be a eulogist at Strom Thurmond. And you can't use Biden and Thurmond in the same sentence paragraph. I mean, now that's politics here and here. And he got up and he did a great eulogy. And it was the oldest Baptist church in South Carolina. And it was so unique. In fact, the altar, standing on the floor of the church, I couldn't reach the floor of the altar. It was above my hand. And I asked the minister, what's the history here? He said, well, when this church was built, when we came to church, it was segregated. Coloreds sit on the ground floor, white people sit on the top. And it was segregated church. And we thought we had to be halfway in between them, talk to both sides. So they built it with an altar sky high. So we got all that ironed out of what was going to happen in Columbia. But he's going to be buried in a place called Enfield, South Carolina, almost to Georgia. And I'd been down there one time before, or the day before the funeral. And if you show up in Enfield and it's not Sunday or church time, and you're not going to a funeral, you got a coat and tie on, you must be pretty important. And so the sheriff met me, and South Carolina State Police with me. And I said, Sheriff, I said, you aware what's going to happen here? He said, yeah, I know all about it. I said, tell me a little about your city. I said, how big is Enfield? He said, well, it depends on how you count, Mr. Groppel. And I must have frowned. I said, how many ways do you have to count? He said, well, we got 3,000 in town, and we got 4,000 in the penitentiary. I said, well, let's assume they stay there. Let's deal with 3,000 here. And I said, no. I said, you aware how big a deal this is going to be? He says, well, people tell me it's going to be a big deal. And I think he had less than a year in the job. Now, are there any law enforcement in the group? Okay. And so I said, Sheriff, I said, you're going to get everybody carrying a gun in South Carolina is going to show up to help you. And I said, you're going to get more help than you ever thought you needed. And probably 10 times more than you actually need. I said, you get me about 1,000 foot of rope, and we're going to rope, and it was county seat too. We're going to rope an area around the courthouse. Everything inside the rope is mine, everything outside the rope is yours. I said, you don't allow anybody to get on my side of the rope without clearance from me. Fine. And I was just trying to stake out my turf. And so we agreed on where the rope was going to be. So I go back to Columbia to do the funeral. Senator Biden wasn't coming. It's a committed service. He was going back to Washington. So I had an escort, lights and sirens. We was traveling a whole lot faster than the motorcade was. So I showed up in Infield, and there had to be 100 horses, mounted police, from Charleston, Columbia, I mean, all over the state. I mean, they would, I couldn't believe how many. And so, you know, the sheriff, he sort of had his head down. I said, now, you better have your head down. I mean, we've already violated our rules here. And I said, Sheriff, I said, can I borrow your gun? He said, what do you want my gun for? I said, I want to start shooting horses. I said, they're on my side of the road. I said, our agreement was, inside the rope is mine, outside the rope, get those damn horses out of the rope. He said, sir, he said, you can't be doing that. I said, Sheriff, we had an agreement. And so he begged off, and I didn't shoot any horses. But I said, I told you you're going to have a lot of help. And we sure as all did. But we got strong buried. On Memorial Day, changing topics. To your credit, and I appreciate the fact that you tied Kenny Kays with Memorial Day. The younger ones, and there aren't many of the younger ones in the room, the younger ones tend to forget the numbers associated with Memorial Day. I'll just, the nearest 100. These are our losses. Revolutionary War, 4,400. War of 1812, 2,200. Mexican War, 13,200. Civil War, 625,000, over 500,000 lost in the Civil War. Spanish-American War, 2,400. World War I, 116,000. World War II, 405,000. World War II and World War I combined didn't beat the Civil War. We lost that many in the Civil War. Korean War, 36,000. Vietnam, 58,000. Persian Gulf, 383. Afghanistan War, 2,300. Iraqi War, 4,400. Total it all up, 1.2 million. That's the dues we paid. Those are the ones that were killed over there. We got a lot of wounded on. But it's to your credit that you have respect for the Memorial Day, and I thank you.